All right, hello everyone. This is Karen Connor with the Tobacco Prevention and Control Program, and I would like to welcome everyone to the third webinar of the Tobacco Prevention and Control Disparities Webinar Series. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the webinar will be shared via email before the end of the week. As a courtesy to everyone, all phones and computers have been muted to avoid complications with audio. You may type questions into the chat box at any time, and we'll be answering those questions at the end of the webinar. So with that note, again, I'd like to welcome everyone this morning. The Tobacco Prevention Control Program Disparity Webinar Series is a series of webinars that focuses on local tobacco prevention control efforts that engage and support populations in Wisconsin that are disproportionately impacted by tobacco. These webinars are in collaboration with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's national networks that are focused on preventing and controlling tobacco-related cancers in special populations. This CDC approach supports a consortium of national organizations to advance the prevention of and commercial tobacco use in cancer in populations experiencing tobacco or cancer-related health disparities. The webinar today features Anneke Mohr, coordinator of the City of Milwaukee Tobacco Free Alliance, and Dr. Scout of the National LGBT Cancer Network. Anneke will present on the activities her coalition is doing locally in Milwaukee to raise awareness about and reduce use of tobacco among the LGBTQ+ population. Dr. Scout will go first and share a national perspective about tobacco use among the LGBTQ+ population and resources available to support states and local coalitions working with those populations. So first, I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Scout, Deputy Director at the National LGBT Cancer Network. The LGBT Cancer Network works to improve the lives of LGBT cancer survivors and those at risk through education, training, and advocacy. The Tobacco-Related Cancer Project is one of 8 CDC-funded national networks tasked with reducing tobacco and cancer-related disparities. The Tobacco-Related Cancer Project aims to reduce tobacco and cancer-related disparities in LGBTQ+ populations by administering a national network of partners, providing training and technical assistance to network members and CDC grantees, increasing their reach of national, state, tribal, and local interventions, and increasing the reach of mass health communications through tailored messaging. So with that introduction, Dr. Scout, go ahead when you are ready.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Hello, everybody. And hi to one of my favorite states. I grew up in Illinois and spent a lot of time driving through Wisconsin to various and sundry social and sporting events and vacations. So near and dear to my heart. Today, let's go through, I'm going to take about the first 45 minutes and talk through some orientation principles related to LGBTQ+ tobacco issues. And then we're going to turn it over, and Anneke is going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that have specifically been happening in Wisconsin, which I think are pretty exciting. So with that, let us move forward and jump right in here. One of the things I want to point out, hold on. This happens every time. I'm gonna try it one more time. There we go. Okay, as I was introduced, I'm the Deputy Director of the National LGBT Cancer Network, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what that means, and also what that means as far as resources for you. But first of all, let's just jump through a little bit of what I will be covering. Again, it's kind of a little a hodgepodge of things around an introduction. Talk a little bit more about what we do as one of the national disparity networks, and then a quick overview about what tobacco use is in our communities. And also, I know one of the issues that sometimes comes up for people is how to use LGBTQ+ terminology. So we're going to go over some kind of do's and don'ts there. And then we're going to dive right into best practices and the type of stuff we train people on across the country that have really provided them with a good first step as far as how to start making your work more engaging. And then we're going to quickly touch on data collection before I turn it over to Anneke. And as was said before, please put your questions in the chat box. I know it's usually a lot easier on webinars to write them than to say them. We're not going to be taking them to the very end, but trust me, no one will remember that long. So I will give personal kudos to anybody who asks questions on this. So don't worry, it's a safe space. Feel free, anything that comes up, we're more than happy to be here and help you get past that. All right. So as was talked about a little bit briefly, the National LGBT Cancer Network, our main foci are to educate, advocate, and train. Unfortunately, we find we have to educate our own communities about our impact with both cancer and tobacco and other cancer risk factors. Too often, we do not realize we are at greater risk for these issues, and so we have to put a lot of investment in helping us to connect those dots. And then there's a lot of organizations out there doing both tobacco control and cancer work, and too often we find those organizations are not including specified outreach to us. So another big part of what we do is to try and encourage them to include us specifically in their programs, in their outreach, in their research, et cetera. And then the last thing is we do a lot of provider training. That makes a huge difference as far as whether we get access to care, whether we get access to services like the quit line, things like that. So we've done a lot of work developing and implementing provider trainings around the country to a wide different sets of groups of people, everything from dentists, to social service providers. And as you can see here, actually, as one of the 8 disparity networks, this is what CDC asks all of the disparity networks to do, and the other 7 of them are all focused on racial ethnic minority populations or people who are otherwise underserved, like people who are low SCS, or people who are do not live in urban areas, people who have mental health issues or behavioral health issues. So we are part of the siblings of those 8 networks, and all of us are asked to do these same things. So if you're looking for expertise in an underserved population, you have a resource for all these 8 populations, and we're all asked to assess the field and identify knowledge gaps, offer trainings, offer technical assistance, link people with each other. And if you are trying to find someone who's a leader in X, we usually should figure out who's the leader in X and be able to connect you up. Create and find the knowledge that to fill the gaps. So like if we think, for example, we do a lot of work on best practices, and we make sure we convene the field to understand what the best practices are so we can continue to present them on webinars like this. And then also create and advise on media strategies, not just the national ones like tips from former smokers, but as well local campaigns doing media. And so we'll give you examples of some of that stuff as we go forward. Hold on, this whole advancing slide thing seems to be a great theory and not. There we go. Okay, great. All right, so let's jump into what we know related to tobacco use. This is actually a graphic that California had used long ago to great success, unfortunately, showing that too often cigarettes have snuck into our communities. And of course, nowadays, it's not just cigarettes, it's all tobacco use, right? So what's the upshot? Tobacco use, and unfortunately, too often LGBT and T are measured separately, but what we do find is that the information for each of them really look pretty analogous. So tobacco use rates are at least 40% higher than for non-queers. And in addition to that, I want to talk to you about a trend that we've been seeing recently. It used to be that we would say cigarette smoking rates were, years ago when I'd started, they were 60% higher. Then they started to drop to 50 to 40. And then what we're now seeing is people are instead measuring tobacco use. And while cigarette smoking has dropped to around 40, unfortunately, if you actually look at all tobacco use in the LGBTQ plus communities, it is starting to rise again. So these days, vaping is all the issue. And as you'll see on the slides coming up next, it really does affect us. And it means it's starting to turn our disparity around and grow it again. As we know, most smokers begin using tobacco before the age of 18. It's about the age of 12 on average, and that holds for the queer community members as well as for non-queers. So it's really a pediatric epidemic. And unfortunately, if you ask us in community surveys and things like that, what are our biggest health issues? We have a tendency to rank tobacco use about number 10. But if you think about it, it affects about 1/3 of our population, and almost all those people are going to lose years off our lives as a result. In comparison, it's much smaller than it's about 1/8 of the population that's affected by HIV, something that gets a lot of attention and gets a lot of energy and focus, but it affects a much smaller group of people, and it can usually be managed with medication these days. So if you look at all of our health issues, epidemiologically, tobacco is the #1 thing taking years off our lives, and too often we may not even realize we have a disparity, much less understand that it's #1. So that knowledge gap hurts us. What about with the trans communities? If you look at the most recent trans survey, the current smoking rate is 36.8%. And if you know what it is for the general population right now, it's actually around 15% or even lower in some communities. So you can see it's much larger for the trans communities. At least 50% higher smoking rates, and that's not even counting tobacco use again. We do know that nicotine use correlates with other life stressors. For example, if you can't pass, if your family does not accept your true gender, if you're doing sex work, if you're low income, you're more likely to be using tobacco. So we really see the story is that it's something to cope with adversity. We also have higher cigar use, and that is something that does not necessarily correlate with the rest of the LGBT communities. So again, unfortunately, we've got a lovely extra disparity there to worry about. As I mentioned before, vaping right now is the driver behind growing our disparity with general population tobacco use again for the first time in many years. Just as examples, we see trans individuals have 5 times higher odds of past 30-day e-cigarette use compared to cisgender folks. We also see that this carries over to LGB youth as well. And you work in tobacco, so hopefully you know this already, but we are seeing the evidence that youth vaping leads to cigarette use. So unfortunately, vaping has become that classic gateway drug that we've kind of joked about. If you're starting with vaping, you're turning over to combustible cigarettes at some point. And the evidence around whether or not vaping can help smokers who are even middle-aged adults quit is definitely mixed at this point. So unfortunately, vaping has few upsides and a lot of hype, let's put it that way, right? What we do know is, as with the trans communities, that the available information shows that our tobacco use disparity rates are really driven by a concept of stigma. And the more stigma we experience, the more likely it is we might be turning to this or other maladaptive health risk behaviors as a way to try and cope with our stress. So this is all a story of stress and social exclusion, unfortunately. Okay, so just a couple of the things around what we do. I talked a little bit about what they ask us to do as a network. Then what you also see is that, for example, we have these actually kind of amazing newsletters with all the information that we're putting out each week, or once a month, not each week, I'm sorry. And these days they're getting chock full and super long, so there must be a fair amount going on. If you're not on our news listserv, we are more than happy to add you. And it's a great way to be updated, not just on what is happening with our organization, but also what kind of tobacco and cancer-related news is going down around the country. We also are quickly building our online resource library. And one of the things I want to say about this is it doesn't have to do with our resources. It has to do with any resources we can find. So the big thing I'll say is if you have anything that's tailored to the sexual and gender minority population, and I use that as analogous to LGBTQ+, please tell us about it so we can put it on our resource library so we can let other people see what kind of great things have been done. Just actually this week, I found some great new glittered dinosaur promotional materials from Alaska, no less. Actually, I think you might see them a little bit later. So we really want to know what you're doing to make sure we can share it out there and give other people a leg up on how to do it faster, better. All right, I'm going to jump through terminology really quickly because we find it can often be a stumbling point for people. So as health professionals, I want to tell you a little bit about the types of things to avoid and the types of things you can lean into, and a little bit on the why. I will say this, one thing about terminology is the real important takeaway on it is don't be afraid to step into the waters. We can tell if you're avoiding using pronouns. We can tell if you're avoiding saying LGBTQ or Q+ or anything like that. So what I really hope you leave with is the idea that you can do this, and if you mess up, you can apologize and ask how to fix it and move forward. One thing that's a really great resource is this video right here. Ask Me by Chronicle of Higher Education. I think you can find it on YouTube. I'm not going to play it now because it's kind of long, but it's a great example, especially with the up and coming population, where there's a proliferation of new terms these days. And from our perspective as health professionals, honestly, that's great because it just means more people have a way to represent who they are in the world and to understand that they're not alone. You know, when I was growing up, the word transgender didn't actually even exist. So I used other identity labels to describe myself in the beginning because none of them seemed to fit. And when I finally was actually informed you're transgender by a bunch of tall ladies at a presentation once, it was a huge step forward in me figuring out that I wasn't as alone, that there was a group of people who are like me. So we love all the new labels, all the new terms, and to respect them with people, to use them, to use the right pronouns, everything like that is a real source of both honor and helping that person with their own sense of self and their own sense of identity. So this video here is a great example of how particularly the younger population with this big proliferation of terms wants you to know about them and wants you to ask them if you have any questions. So I encourage you to take a look. Okay, so let's get into kind of what type of terminology are the current ones, some of the current ones being used. Again, it's a big proliferation, and some of the ones to make sure you avoid. So for sexual orientation, obviously this is who you partner with. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, bi for short, bi plus, kind of meaning the fact that bi is sometimes an umbrella that includes other things like pansexual, asexual, a spectrum. Everything on the left-hand column is very commonly used. Some of them may not be as well known to you. For example, pansexual. So that's the idea that you choose your partner is not based upon any gender presentation. So it's not necessarily that they're male, female, bi. You just you choose them based upon who they are. So that's what's important to you. Asexual is a very growing group of people these days, and those are people who identify as not being sexual. So you understand the word asexual is the opposite of sexual. So people who may be looking for relationships but are not interested in a sexual component for that. Ace is the shorthand for that. And then ace is also considered to be a spectrum itself, kind of like bi has a group of things underneath it. And that may include aromantic, people who are not looking for romantic relationships, different types of things like that. So ace spectrum refers to the idea that there's a whole spectrum of people who are on that continuum of kind of not being as interested in sexual representation in their relationships or in their lives. And then two-spirit, that one can sometimes be used a little erroneously as only for gender identity, but it comes from the Native American Indian population, and it can represent anybody on an LGBTQ spectrum. So I would encourage you to understand and remember that it's used for that population and is a relatively new, not a historic label, but nonetheless a helpful one to talk about how within that population there's a different types of sometimes respect and honor given for people who present differently on the LGBTQ spectrum. And then a big question we get is it okay to use queer? These days, so many of our national organizations are taking this formerly negative word, changing it to positive, even putting it in their titles. So I would actually really encourage you at this point, you should be comfortable with saying the word queer if someone else is using it with you. I wouldn't necessarily lead with it, but it's, you know, as you can see, LGBTQ+, it's part of what we're using very actively. Things just not to use. The word homosexuals is kind of considered to be a very outsider term and not something we're using very much ourselves, so it doesn't really connote the most welcoming. And then also, please don't forget that there is a push to erase bi in our communities, and I'll have another slide about this in another second. Unfortunately, bi people too often don't get inclusion in our communities, and we also don't get inclusion from outside our communities either, which means that the bi population is too often neither here nor there, and as a result shows even more health disparity problems. So as you're developing materials, outreach plans, looking at advisors, things like that, please remember that bi is very, very important to include. And in that same vein, pansexual is one of those things considered to be under that bi plus umbrella. So sometimes there's a lot of different words for very similar concepts. We should remember that they're linked. I know I went through that very fast. So if there's any question on any of those, because it's always harder for me to see it from the terms of the outside of someone who's just struggling with it, please write those questions in the chat boxes and we will be happy to get to them. So just as a little bi moment, as a subset, as a takeout here, people sometimes do not realize that if you look at this, this is a good representation of how of the LGBTQ plus communities, bi is the largest group by far. So now compare that to how often you see things aimed at or targeting bisexual specifically, or saying bi or including bi. Now you realize that again, we've got that erasure issue that we want to make sure we counter as we do justice to public health outreach and engagement. All right, so in the same vein, for gender identity, what are some terms that are being used and some terms to avoid? This can get a little bit more complicated because there's some things here that are a little bit close. Like, for example, the third one you see down there, trans man with a space, is great. On the other hand, the third one over in the other column, trans man without a space, not so great. So why is the space important there? It's because trans people like myself, we really want to convey the fact that we're not a different species, we're not a different race. We are simply a type of person. So trans should be an adjective. And when you have trans space man, that's a type of man, right? On the other hand, when you have trans man put together, that could be something different altogether. So that's why that space makes it into an adjective and shows that we're a type of man, a type of person, a type of woman, and it's really important. There is some sensitivity in the communities related to this. So this is some of the areas where I would, always the safest thing to do is make sure when you're developing materials, have community members, not just one, but a few, review them to make sure your terminology is good. Just some other things not to do, again, transgenders and transgendered. Again, it's not an adjective. So transgenders indicates that we're like a different type of species. Transgendered is like we've been sunburned or something has happened to us and made us transgendered. We want to stay away from that framing. We instead want to say we're a type of person. Transgenderism is rarely used, but it has a tendency to be used by right-wing groups. And then the two things, the one thing I would really say to be careful about, and I was giving this presentation at a comp cancer program in New Jersey, and apparently I got them a little bit too late because the head of comp cancer had been written up for using this with a friend, and that's the word tranny. That is quite inflammatory. As inflammatory as anything gets. Why is it the case? Because it comes from the sex work world. So while it sounds like a cute shortening of the word transgender, on the other hand, it's really used about sex workers by Johns, basically. So to invoke something that comes from the sex work world is something that people are not happy about. Okay, and then also just remember, straight is not the opposite of LGBT, right? Because straight's the opposite of just LGBT. If you really want to talk about the opposite of LGBT, you got to either say non-LGBT or cis straight. And that gets us back over to our other words over here on the left. Cis is the opposite of trans. NB is just a longer way of saying the initials N and B. And then non-binary is what that stands for. NB stands for non-binary, which talks about people who don't identify. If you can imagine, gender might be a football field. We think of things in terms of the goalpost area as one male, one female, right? But maybe you're somewhere else on the field, or maybe you've got a three-dimensional chess game as your representation of gender. Whatever it is you're doing in your head, you don't just have two goalposts, which are the only places to be. Those folks would identify as non-binary. And then as queer can represent anybody in the LGBT spectrum, genderqueer is also a way to talk about people who are transgender and may represent somewhere again as potentially non-binary. So it gets a little bit more confusing here, but I think that's why you've got the takeaway here, some things to avoid and lots of things it's perfectly fine to say. In a closely related vein, so similarly, intersex and disorders of sexual development are two words that are being used to represent what we used to think of as hermaphrodites. But two, do understand if you're adding the I for intersex to the LGBTQ spectrum, then please also include content or outreach or something related to I. Don't just tack it on for fun. There are usually distinct issues with this population because a lot of what intersex folks deal with comes in a very, very early life experience related to surgeries when they're infants, things like that. All right, so upshot is there's a lot of ways you can say safe things: LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQ+, LGBTQI, queer. Also, SOGI is often used for data collection, stands for sexual orientation, gender identity. And then SGM, which I used earlier, sexual and gender minority, is a shorter way. And it's usually feds or states or things like that that are using that. All these are great ways to talk about it. These should be your go-tos when you're first trying to refer to the population. And any one of these is perfectly safe. So remember, the important thing is don't get frozen, just keep moving on this. And just as an example, it's interesting because this, I just happened to pull it off of Instagram, the LGBT Wales account. And you can see, obviously run, I'm gonna guess by some younger people, but look at some of these acronyms they have to express their own gender identity. It's great to see, but just to show you, so J is pansexual, asexual, and gender fluid. Ave is male to female, transgender. Jax is gay and gender fluid. Sarah is bi and pangender. So you can see there's even more words out here than I talked to you about. Don't be afraid of them. Understand that it's a part of people finding a home and social support. So we love the fact that there's more terms out there. And just a note related to pronouns, as people may be more familiar with that, people are using gender neutral pronouns more commonly. Usually it's the singular they, which actually does have historical roots for quite a long time in our language as being used. The important thing is, how do you do it? How do you either use a pronoun if you thought of someone as a she and now they asked to be a he, or they asked to be a they? How do you do it? You know, honestly, the trick is practice yourself. Have quiet conversations with them. As you're taking a shower or something like that, imagine you're talking about them and keep using the right pronoun. Eventually, you're going to, get it right, and it'll come out when you're having conversations about them in real life too. Are you unsure which pronoun someone uses? The big secret is we just ask. Have you messed it up? Don't worry, everybody does. Just thank them, thank them for the correction, say you're sorry, move on quickly, don't make it a big deal. Now, the last thing is actually a really important thing and something you can walk away from this training with immediately. People might have seen the idea that people are being introduced, or they have it on their email, a tagline saying what their pronouns are. And this is one of the most powerful and tiny ways to show that you're LGBTQ+ welcoming. Just add that tagline to your own email signature or to your introduction somewhere. So you don't want to say preferred pronoun, you just want to say pronouns. So like, my name is Scout, my pronouns are he, him, his. And that's as simple as it is. It sits on my email, but the important thing is, for any LGBTQ+ person who sees my email, I'm immediately conveying that I'm very welcoming and supportive. So that's very powerful. All right, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit here. And as we've got about 15 minutes left of what I'm gonna talk about, I wanna go through what we often train on related to best and promising practices. We have longer best and promising practices for tobacco, but we've really distilled this down to 7 things, which are usually the smartest and best ways to think of overarching best and promising practices, as well as things you can step in and do really quickly with your project, with your organization, things like that. It's a good set of benchmarks. This document can be found at the hyperlink on the title here, and I believe the slides will be available to you afterwards, so you'll be able to click it there. With that, let me jump through. You see there's 7 overarching principles we have there. I'm gonna give you examples of each. First one is, Wisconsin was actually one of the early states in the country, if I'm correct, to have sexual and gender minority employment protection. But it's important to note that of the country, you see all those red states are states where we are not fully protected. So unfortunately, we realize, and legal protections don't always mean that in practice we get those protections, right? We realize that we are not usually able to go to places and understand that we have employment protections. So it's even more important to make sure that you are conveying this welcome to your employees first. You're never going to do a good job with outreaching for clients and things like that unless you actually show that you value and support your queer employees in the first place. So first of all, make sure you have the non-discrimination protections somewhere easily visible and on your webpage. And unfortunately, continued discrimination is really an issue, particularly the trans communities. Washington, D.C. did some resume testing and found out that literally 69% of employers for an entry-level job would not call back someone like me who is openly trans on my CV as a white trans masculine guy. So that's a mess. Can you imagine if you were part of a population where 69% of employers didn't even want to give you a job at McDonald's simply for who you were? That's the reality that we deal with as trans people. So that's even more reason to make sure that you are countering that in your own organization. A great way to do that is to have an employee resource group. This is not a support group. This is not, let's find other queers at work. This is a group of professionals who can be a resource to their organization. This just happens to show that Mount Sinai has done a lot of work on this, has employee resource groups for a lot of different underserved populations in their own employee base. But truth be told, if you want the best access to experts who know what you're doing and know how you should engage queer people, it's always going to be your employees first. So not just creating a group, but then valuing them and asking them to look at your programs for how they can be more welcoming. Of course, this is another basic step to make sure you're welcoming, make sure that you have all gender bathrooms. I spent way too much of my life for a long time, I was working in a skyscraper and I had to go 4 floors down just to find a bathroom that I felt comfortable going to. So it makes a big difference as far as how comfortable people feel in the physical space and welcome psychologically with the organization. All right, so that's the first step, is start with your own employee base and make sure that you're valuing and welcoming the queers in there. Second one is make sure you've got queers on your advisory bodies. Most everybody has a community advisory body if you work for a nonprofit, or you have advisory groups if you're part of state departments of health, things like that. This is a video by Cochrane Institute, the evidence-based healthcare people, about how to make sure you include different representatives of underserved organizations on your advisory groups. And here's an example from how you can really accelerate your work as a result. American Society of Clinical Oncologists just now created their own specific LGBTQ task force. They brought in some outsiders and they included some of their own employees, and they are, as a result, poised to do more over the next year related to LGBTQ engagement than I have seen them do over the last decade. So it also can really be a way to like supercharge your activity in this area. Okay, then on to the next one. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a second too, but make sure you're collecting data about LGBTQ plus folks. You can't understand whether you're serving us unless you check. You can't understand if you're serving us well unless we're part of the evaluation. And you can't understand what health problems we have unless you're measuring those health problems. So it's always a little bit of a challenge because it may not have been tradition to collect these data, but that means you're masking it and you're hiding our health problems. So just as an example, this is the way the question was asked for the quit lines for National Jewish for a long time. And the North American Quitline Consortium has actually just made their new measure, newer version of this, mandatory. So while 50% of the states asked it on their quit lines last year, this year you're going to find that 100% of states will be asking sexual and gender minority data questions. In that same way, there is a huge growth in the number of states, places, surveillance instruments who are asking these questions as a routine. In 2008, no states were asking gender identity on their behavioral risk factor social survey. And then in 2017, the last year we had fully available data, 35 states over the last 2 years had been collecting sexual and gender minority data at that same surveillance instrument. So it went from 0 to 35 from 2008 to 2017 in less than 10 years. So there is a huge upward trend with doing this data collection. Make sure you're not left behind. Another harder way to do this is with electronic health records. It's the new bleeding edge of data collection these days. I will talk about that a little bit more later, but we do have information about organizations and how they've stepped through the steps to do this as you see with all this list of the types of things that Mount Sinai, one of the big cancer centers, recently did in order to make sure they did a good job of collecting LGBTQ plus data. All right, next best practice is to establish and communicate cultural competency standards for programs. So not only would this be having training, making sure people actually come to the training and that it's not just an optional thing that the, you know, people who already care about it are going to, but then communicating the fact that you expect this both to your patient base, to your vendor base, to your provider base, all of those things. This is just an example of when, of all things, the tobacco program in North Dakota asked us to come in and train a large provider group. It wasn't just tobacco providers, it was a large provider group. But the amazing thing about that in North Dakota was before that, the number of providers who were willing to list themselves as being publicly LGBT welcoming in North Dakota was only 6. And after that 1-2 hour training, 70 more providers said yes to that listing. So it really changes the number of people and people to understand that they have to be public about it. If you're hiding your light under a bushel right here, unfortunately, you're still part of the problem because we can't tell you're welcoming. So it really makes a difference as far as people not just understanding what steps to take, but realizing they have to promote the fact that they're welcoming in order for it to be real. Here's another example in Michigan. Not only were they conveying to the community members our quitline is welcoming, but as well they were also conveying to their quitline vendors, we absolutely expect you to be welcoming, and if there's a problem with it, we're going to be hearing about it. So it's, remember, you have to not just say you're welcoming quietly, not just say it to the community, but you also have to spread that news to your own base of people who are doing the care provision itself. And then the 5th of our 7 things we have as best practices is, you know something, and Anneke really will show how this really comes to fruition, that the community-based leaders and organizations get you such great bang for your buck. Even a minor investment in community-based organizations can pay such huge dividends. We consistently find around the country that they are the experts in how to change people's behavior locally. And they've got faith from the community and trust from the community and reach into the community that you just can't get from outside of it. So the more you can engage community-led both programs and organizations, the more successful any of your outreach work is going to be. And sometimes it's not necessarily even from the LGBT communities, it could be from other communities serving underserved populations. This is actually an example of a mama van that was brought by the historically African-American sorority, which is not specifically queer focused whatsoever, but they brought it to the largest LGBT leadership conference, which just happened, as a matter of fact, in Dallas, Texas, because for them it was really important to make sure that the LGBTQ population was able to have good access to mammograms. And so even these alliances between different overlapping populations can be very powerful and very, very effective. Okay, 6th of our 7th best practices, make sure you're including LGBTQ plus tailored materials in your existing health and wellness campaigns. These days, so much of our media goes out on social media. We're not placing it with ad companies as much like we used to before. It means the bar of entry has really gone down. And it means there's kind of no excuse not to actually do a better job of making sure there's some tailored materials for lots of underserved subpopulations, including queers. We actually specialize in making a bunch of things you can put your logo on. This, what you see on the screen, is one of those things right now. We're happy to take off our logo and you can put yours on if you'd like to put it out. Likewise, same with this set of ads you see right here now. Why quit smoking now? Because us, because me, because her. Or we have the same ads in Spanish. And this is actually a cancer screening version of the same ad in Spanish. So any one of these, as long as all you have to be is a member of our network, and that's free, there's nothing else to do, we'll be happy to give you the art for this and you can put your logo on it so you can have some tailored materials. But even if we don't make them for you, please make them for yourself. And one last example, people might have seen the Tips from Former Smokers campaign. We can't call it tips because that's a federal thing. But we did make a Tips-esque campaign. And this is just 3 of, I think we've got 7 different ads. I'm looking over there because it's up on the wall, of examples of these ads. Again, you can put your title on these. And also this Out Proud Smoke Free is kind of a logo we've been using. I'm not sure, Anneke might have been using it in Milwaukee too, but we've encouraged people around the country to use that as kind of a national brand of being out proud, smoke free, vape free, tobacco free, as a way to kind of bind together some of the activities that are happening across the country. Oh, and here we've got our glittered dinosaurs. So this is just the new examples I found from Alaska, where they put together community tailored ads. And in this case, they're particularly talking about gender and HPV. So there's a glittersaurus there on that yellow one. But it's easy to do this stuff. No excuse not to, really, is the message. Okay, and our last best practice is make sure you're disseminating your findings and your lessons learned. If you're collecting data about us, if you're collecting evaluation information about us, put it back out to our community so we can see it too. This is a great example of Hawaii doing a report on sexual and gender minority health, and they even did it on youth the next year. So I encourage you to look it up and get an example of what they've done. Iowa's done a similar report. Pennsylvania has done several similar reports. And then this is, I love, because I found this on one of the partner organizations. It's a community-based organization in Vermont. And here they are talking about the importance of public health surveillance information with the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. Why? Because Vermont has been a good partner with them in creating documents like this one, where they make sure not just the information comes in, but that it gets pushed back out to where the community can use it to justify funding, to write grant proposals with, to demonstrate the impact of their programs. So don't just take information from us, please make sure you turn it back out and give it to us to use as well. And those are examples of the 7 best practices. We've got plenty more examples on any of them, and we're more than happy to talk to you about those things too. The last thing I'll say just before I turn it over to Anneke is just a tiny bit more about data. And as I said, electronic health records are kind of the bleeding edge of data collection now. It's where we really need to have it. But data collection's broader rubric. It's everything from community needs assessment, surveillance, to intake, to evaluation. And related to that, we have some resources related to each of those steps too. So for example, we actually have a sample community needs assessment that we developed. It had been used around the country, and then we recently freshened it again as Pennsylvania put it into place. So if you're looking for a community developed needs assessment that you can use around health, wellness, cancer, tobacco issues, we've got an instrument for you and an outline of how it is people have administered this successfully to get good data off of it. And that's free. As well, we have suggested measures related to intake, things like that. You actually already saw this before, so it's in a different place. And if you're looking at electronic health record integration, we not only have suggestions off of forms, we have a full webinar that we also created related to how to make sure that SGM is included on your electronic health records. So that is all stuff that we are more than willing to share with you. And as well, we are also, as I explained earlier, here to provide technical assistance and training to you. So this is just a little bit of some of the resources that are out there and some of the good, smart steps to take. But we view all this as something where we're more than willing to have you contact us back and say, help, we need a little bit more of this, that, or the other thing. And with that, I'm going to remind you one more time, please type in questions. We're going to be answering them at the end. And now let me cede control of the screen and all the yakking over to Anneke, and let's hear what Wisconsin's been doing specifically.
All right, thank you, Scout. And like Scout said, put any questions you have into the chat box, and we will address those at the end of the webinar. So like Scout said, and like I said earlier, next we have Anneke Mohr presenting. Anneke is the coordinator of the City of Milwaukee Tobacco Free Alliance here in Wisconsin, and we are thrilled to have her present to us. So go ahead, Anneke.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Scout, for that great introduction. I'm really glad that you're able to provide the national overview. And now I'll shift the focus and talk about what we're doing locally here in Milwaukee. So I'll talk a little bit about the data that we have on LGBTQ tobacco use in Wisconsin. I'll talk about the community readiness assessment that we did, which then led to video stories, and also our work addressing industry targeting at Milwaukee Pride, and then I'll close it out with some lessons learned. So this data here comes from the Wisconsin Behavior Risk Factor Surveillance System, also called the BRFSS. This is from 2018. And as Scout mentioned, a lot of states have had the option of adding questions about sexual identity and gender identity. And in Wisconsin, I know for the YRBS, for the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, we added a question about same-sex sexual behavior in 2007, and it wasn't until 2011 that they added a sexual identity question. I believe they added gender identity in 2015. And so for the BRFS, I believe that has been a similar time frame. And so we've really only had this data for less than 10 years. But we do have available shows that our statewide smoking rate for adults is 16%. So that's roughly close to the national average. And for adults who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, the rate is 26%. In addition, we know that for City of Milwaukee residents, according to this survey, 24% of Milwaukee adults said that they smoke. When we look at other identities, we see that for Native Americans, the rate is much higher at 37%, and people with low income and low education also have higher rates. And as Scout mentioned, we're also seeing higher rates of e-cigarette use within the LGBT community. So according to the 2018 data, 30% of Wisconsin LGBT adults said that they had ever used an e-cigarette, compared to 19% of all adults. All right, so this shows some local community survey data that we have. This comes from a local nonprofit called Diverse and Resilient, and they had a grant to do smoking cessation that was tailored to the LGBT community from 2008 to 2012. As part of that grant, they also did surveys at Pride festivals. So they went to Green Bay, Milwaukee, Madison, La Crosse, and the Chippewa Valley, or the Eau Claire area. And over those years, there were a total of 2,412 surveys collected, and the overall smoking rate was 41.2%. So that's even higher than what we're seeing now. It's important to think about what was happening at that time. So we know that our statewide smoke-free law went into effect in 2010. And so anything before 2010 might have led to higher smoking rates too. But we are seeing from the community data that we have, this is a really high smoking rate. All right. So given the challenges that Diverse and Resilient had with their Room to Breathe program, they had a really poor turnout. People just weren't ready to quit, weren't interested in quitting. So Diverse and Resilient connected with our coalition, and they decided to form an LGBT work group within the Milwaukee Tobacco Free Alliance. So the first thing that we did as a work group was to do a community readiness assessment, and this helped to inform our future efforts and help to explain past attempts. So the community readiness model, it uses the stages of change theory, and so it involves doing structured interviews with key informants from the community. So you pick a community, you pick a topic, and then you do interviews. There's a whole scoring process, and then that leads you to a final readiness score. So for the Milwaukee LGBT community, it turned out that they were in the stage 2, the denial and resistance stage, when it comes to addressing tobacco use. And this was done back in 2014. And based on one of the interviews that was done, one quote that we have that really kind of reflects the overall feeling was, "It's a really popular thing, especially with the males. There's a lot of stress that comes with being part of the LGBT community. So aside from the recreational activity, using tobacco is a quick stress reliever." So this just highlights how people know that it's common, they know that people are doing it, but they don't see it as a problem. They see it as an acceptable way to relieve the stress that comes along with being part of the community. So as we were forming this work group and as we've gone on to do the work, we've had to really clarify our values and what we stand for and what we hope to do within the community. And so we really value shared power and leadership. We currently have 2 co-chairs, and so although I'm the one in the background that's helping to convene people, it's really community leaders who are moving the work forward. We also make sure that we try to highlight intersectionality, just recognizing that people have multiple identities. So in addition to sexual orientation or gender identity, we want to be honoring, racial identity, class, and any other types of identities, and just recognizing that each of our identities might contribute to our health behaviors and our experience in the world. We also try to display a sense of dignity. We try to highlight visibility and show that we're here, we're part of the community, even though you might not see us everywhere. We're trying to lift people up and lift people's stories up to show that we are here and part of the community. We also place a really high value on accountability. So we've had some instances over the course of doing our work where not everybody was happy with how things were done or how things were framed. And so we're always open to feedback, and we make sure that everybody within the LGBT community in Milwaukee is heard and has a voice and can hold us accountable. And finally, we try to be data driven. And so that leads back to the readiness assessment and using those results to inform our next steps. So along with that low level of readiness, being in that stage 2, the recommended actions are to raise awareness, do education, and show that this is a problem, and switch the framing from having it be this acceptable thing to showing the harm that it does and how we'll be better off if we can address this as a community. So we have found people who have either struggled with quitting smoking or struggled with secondhand smoke. And so we've created infographics and video stories with various people in the community. We've also been really intentional about partner engagement. So we've tried to make sure that we have representatives from all the major LGBT serving organizations in the city. We've done outreach at almost all of the major events throughout the year. And now we are currently trying to figure out a plan for doing bar outreach, just because we know that the bar scene is a place where people still go to socialize and still go to feel safe and meet other people. And it can also be a place where they might be tempted to relapse or continue smoking. Finally, we do try to integrate an LGBT lens into our youth prevention work. So we have had a FACT group. So FACT is our statewide youth tobacco prevention movement. So we worked with a school that has a high number of LGBT identifying students, and we do FACT with them. Last year, we partnered with another substance abuse coalition to do the first ever Milwaukee LGBT Youth Substance Abuse Summit. And then we've partnered with the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee to work with their drag show, which happens every year in February. So here we have some of the stories that we've gathered and tried to lift up. We have Montel Infinity Ross in the blue and then Lady J in the red. They are 2 performers in the community, and they were actually both the MCs for the drag show. So they were sort of our first champions to share their stories. We also featured a story from Chris in the upper left-hand corner. He's from the Milwaukee Gay Volleyball Association. So he talks about how getting into that group helped him replace smoking with a healthier behavior. And then we have Megan in the green on the right, and she talks about her role as a parent and wanting to have family-friendly spaces free of secondhand smoke for her kids. Our 2 most recent stories feature Sid Robinson on the left, and he did a video with his healthcare provider talking about how, as he was going through gender-affirming care, he quit smoking as he was starting to take hormones, given the interactions between smoking and hormone use and how that can impact blood pressure and other issues. And then on the right, we did a story infographic with another drag king performer, Maker Moist, who talks about how finding better ways to cope with anxiety and stress is what helped them to quit smoking. So as I mentioned, the drag show has been one venue where we've been able to share this messaging. So we use the tagline, "Smoking is such a drag." And we had Lady J's story talking about having asthma, quitting smoking to deal with that. Montel's story was about how he really likes to dance and realized that he needed to quit smoking if we wanted to continue dancing. And so as they were MCs, they were able to kind of weave in their story throughout the night. And then we had these materials that also had their stories on them too. So here we have some examples of targeted ads, and this really helps to explain why we have such higher smoking rates. It's really because the industry has made an effort to target our community before health groups were targeting our community. So Project Scum was one of the first documented cases of targeted marketing to the LGBT community. So Scum actually stood for Subculture Urban Marketing. And I believe it was Camel cigarettes that were trying to figure out how to market their product to gay men in San Francisco in the Castro district. But the fact that they're calling it Scum really shows what they think about the community. We've also seen tobacco companies using rainbows and using language about pride and freedom. So really using messaging that speaks to us, but using it to sell us products that are ultimately going to kill us. And so we actually saw this marketing firsthand here in Milwaukee at Milwaukee Pride Fest. We were tabling there back in 2016. We were in the health and wellness area. Thought we were doing great things, sharing prevention and cessation information. And then lo and behold, we see that there's a Newport trailer there. And so this was a targeted marketing tool. They were building off of the themes of pleasure and fun that we associate with Pride Fest and using it to sell these menthol cigarettes. So people could go through it, they're seeing the advertising, it had like a bar sort of atmosphere, and then at the end they were able to get a pack of menthols for $1 and get one of these coupons to get a second pack. And so this really kind of caught us off guard, but really helped us to come together to address this targeting in our own backyard. We were able to get 20 organizations to sign on to a letter, which we gave to the Pride Fest board and requested that they stop allowing this at our festival. They were getting some money from Newport to have a presence there, and so we managed to get some replacement funding to really highlight that we're not for sale and we don't think this is a good thing for our community. So Scott, we did use the Out Proud Free logo this year at Pride Fest. We had Snapchat filters, we threw it on a picture frame, we had stickers made and t-shirts and water bottles with the logo on it. We chose to do the Out Proud Vape Free messaging. It's kind of hard to see the vape, but it's written within the F. It was really nice to have that resource available because we don't really have the capacity to come up with branding ourselves. And so we really appreciate having the network develop these sorts of things that we can use and adapt for the local context. We did get quite a few uses of the Snapchat filter. I think we got something like 25,000 uses over the weekend, and it only cost us maybe $100. So I would definitely recommend using these tools and if you have any events coming up, it's something that you can have on hand. And it's a great way to reach the youth who tend to use Snapchat more. So some of the key lessons that we've learned are that it's really important to work within the community and find those key messengers who can share their stories and then bring their friends on board, bring their colleagues on board, and kind of build out from there. It's been really important for us to share the stories and show the local impact. So what we've been hearing is, people have asthma, that's a problem for them. People struggle with physical activity, they want to stay active and keep dancing. Smoking prevents them from doing that. People who are having families want to make sure that they're in spaces that are family friendly and free of secondhand smoke. People if they have mental health issues, it's ultimately in their benefit to stop smoking and find other ways to cope. And so all of those sorts of themes are what we found from doing the stories, and we hope that if we were to repeat the readiness assessment that we might find a higher level based on all of the work that we've done to collect stories and raise awareness. We've also found that it's been really important to be persistent. It's you know, given the low level of readiness, it's not something that we can tackle overnight, but through growing the work group and through continuing to show up at all of the major community events, people know that we're not going anywhere. We're going to continue to say that this is a problem until other people join us. And finally, we know that it's really important to build power by continuing to add new voices to the table. So over the past 5 years, our membership has grown from like 5 people to now about 20 people. And you know, there have been staff transitions along the way, and so we have to just keep engaging and re-engaging and inviting new people to join us. So that's all that I have. I do have our social media contacts here. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We also have all of the videos available on YouTube. So if you go to bit.ly/tobacco-free-pride, that's bit.ly/tobacco-free-pride, you can see all of the video stories. We'd love to have people share them on your social media and really help spread the word. We do have copies of the infographics too. So if anybody would like some, I'm happy to mail you some of those. Or I can email them too. So we're really happy to be a resource and welcome any questions.
All right, thank you, Anneke. Like Anneke said, if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. I'm not seeing any at this point. Just a reminder that this is a great opportunity. You have 2 great resources on the line, ready and willing to answer any questions you have. But while we're waiting for potential questions, I just wanted to thank everyone for being on the line today. Like I said earlier, this is the 3rd webinar of the Tobacco Prevention Control Program webinar Disparities Webinar Series. We will not be having a webinar in February, and then we will be having the 4th webinar at the end of March on March 25th. And it will be from 10 o'clock to 11:30 again, and the population of focus will be the rural population. So I encourage everyone to be online for that, and I will send out a reminder and a schedule so you can put that on your calendars. But again, we will not be having a webinar in February. It looks like we did get one question. Can you share ideas about state advocacy organizations that should be more involved in the statewide coalition? So Anneke, you might have the best answer for this.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Darcy. I would say Fair Wisconsin is the main LGBTQ advocacy group here, and they have at least one staff person based in Madison. They also do a policy day every year. And I would definitely reach out to them and have them get involved.
Thank you, Anneke. We'll wait maybe just 1 more minute for questions. And if we don't see any, then we will just end the webinar. Again, thank you everyone for being on the line, and we'll talk to you again at the end of March. Take care.
Have a really good